The silent but steadfast. Trees hold history within their rings. While empires rise and fall, these ancient guardians record every drought, every flood, and shift in climate.
In the summer of 1963, a Chinese botanist climbed a remote mountain in eastern China and found something that should not have existed: 7 trees, a species the modern world had never recorded. A living survivor from the last ice age, clinging to the top of one mountain because there was nowhere else left to go. By the late 1980s, only 3 of those 7 were still alive. What China did next to save them took 60 years, 2 continents, and a discovery that no one involved could have predicted. The discovery. Mount Baishanzu rises in Zhejiang province in eastern China. It is not a famous mountain. Before 1963, it held no particular scientific weight. The expedition that changed that was led by a botanist named M.H. Wu, whose task was ordinary field documentation, the slow, patient cataloging of plant life in remote terrain that quietly builds most of what science knows about the species living far from people. What Wu found near the summit, at roughly 1,800 meters, was a stand of trees unlike anything in the existing record. The needles carried a silver band that caught the light in a way no known fir did. The cones stood upright on the branches, pale green and elongated, almost like candles fixed along the limbs. The bark had its own particular color and grain. The whole shape of the trees suggested a species built for a world that no longer surrounded this mountain. A world shaped by ice age cold, by pressure, by a quality of light found only at high elevation during a climate era that had ended thousands of years earlier. Wu counted 7 individuals on a single hillside. He documented them as thoroughly as his time and equipment allowed. When the collected specimens were later analyzed, the identification came back fast and certain. A new species named Abies baishanzuensis for the mountain where it had been found. From that moment on, the species carried a label no botanist would wish on it. It was instantly the rarest conifer alive. 7 trees, 1 mountain, 1 slope, no other confirmed individuals anywhere on the planet. The scientific weight of the discovery went past simple rarity. The Baishanzu fir was what botanists call a glacial relic, a species that had once spread widely during the Ice Age, when the cold conditions it depended on stretched across a much larger territory, and had been in slow retreat ever since as the planet warmed and its required conditions shrank to higher and higher ground. The trees Wu found were not merely the last of their kind. They were the final point of a very long withdrawal, a population that had been climbing this mountain for thousands of years, chasing the cold upward as it thinned, until there was no higher ground left and 7 individuals made their last stand on this single slope. They had held that position since long before any living civilization existed in the valleys below them. To understand why this mattered so much to the people who found it, it helps to picture what a glacial relic actually represents. During the coldest stretch of the last ice age, forests built from cold-adapted conifers like this one likely covered enormous stretches of what is now eastern China, spreading across lowlands and hillsides wherever the temperature and moisture were right. As the ice retreated and the planet warmed, the range of trees like this one did not expand along with the warmth. It contracted. Populations that had once covered wide territory found themselves squeezed into smaller and smaller pockets where the old conditions still held, usually high on mountains, where elevation kept the air cold even as the lowlands changed around them. Generation after generation, seeds that fell into warmer ground below simply failed, while only the trees clinging to the coldest, highest ground kept producing offspring that survived. Over thousands of years, that slow filtering process pushed the species higher and higher, off gentler slopes and onto steeper ones, off wider ranges and onto narrower ones, until the population it had once been was reduced to a single hillside near a mountain summit in Zhejiang province. By the time Wu found them, The 7 trees on Mount Baishanzu were not simply rare individuals of a widespread species. They were the entire remaining range of that species, compressed onto ground no larger than a few city blocks. There was no other population elsewhere to draw on, no neighboring valley with a healthier stand that could replenish what was lost here. Whatever happened on this one slope was, in effect, happening to the entire species at once. From 7 to 3. The first response to the discovery followed a pattern conservation science has seen many times with newly identified rare species: the urge to collect, to study under controlled conditions, to bring specimens into botanical gardens where experts could watch them closely and shield them from the unpredictability of the wild. 3 of the 7 Baishanzu firs were taken from the mountain and moved to botanical gardens, 1 to Beijing and others to institutions with the staff and resources to care for a species this significant. The trees received careful, expert attention. Conditions were monitored and managed. The intent was sincere. All 3 died. At the time, no one understood exactly why. The assumption was that the shock of transplanting had been too severe, or that the garden simply could not replicate something essential about the mountain that the trees needed to live. Those assumptions were not wrong, only incomplete, and without knowing precisely what the missing factor was, every attempt to compensate for it produced another failure. The 4 trees left on the mountain faced a separate danger. The slope Wu had found them on was not stable ground. Steep terrain, heavy rainfall, and the mountain's particular geology made it prone to sudden movement that could tear away soil and roots together. Floods and landslides in the years after the discovery claimed 2 more trees. By the time the broader scientific world had fully absorbed the significance of the original find, 7 had become 3. By 1987, 3 ancient trees remained on the same slope where Wu had counted 7, 24 years before. The survivors were old, each more than a century in age at minimum, with the eldest possibly stretching back several hundred years. The International Union for Conservation of Nature placed the Baishanzu fir among the 12 most endangered plant species on the planet. Not trees, plants, in every form plant life takes on Earth. Out of all of it, this species had reached a level of scarcity that put it in the most severe category the IUCN system allows. 3 trees do not make a viable population. A viable population needs genetic variety, ongoing reproduction, and enough individuals to absorb the losses that weather, disease, and plain bad luck will always inflict. 3 old trees on one slope, producing seeds that were not sprouting, were not really a population anymore. They were the last physical trace of a species that had become, by almost any working definition, already functionally extinct. The 3 survivors were not a population. They were the final 3 coins of a currency no longer being minted. There was also a quieter danger that took years to fully appreciate. The trees were aging without replacement. Even setting aside landslides and failed transplants, a population made up entirely of old individuals is a population running on borrowed time by definition. Old trees eventually die of old age no matter how carefully they are protected, and if nothing younger is growing to take their place, the countdown to extinction keeps running regardless of how well the survivors are guarded. Every year that passed without a new generation establishing itself on the slope was a year the species moved closer to a finish line that no amount of protecting the adults could prevent. The 3 trees could be fenced, monitored, and defended from landslides indefinitely, and the species would still end the moment those 3 individuals finally died of age, unless something changed about what happened to their seeds. What happened to those 3 coins over the following 4 decades is the real story here. Why they wouldn't reproduce. The 3 remaining trees did something that seemed hopeful at first and turned out to be maddening. Each spring they flowered, each summer they set cones. Each autumn, those cones opened and released seeds. The trees were not sterile. They had no trouble producing the biological material reproduction requires. The trouble was what became of that material once it left the tree. Almost nothing germinated. Between 2007 and 2017, a decade during which researchers actively monitored the site while the trees produced tens of thousands of seeds, fewer than 3 wild seedlings were ever recorded on the slope. 3 seedlings across 10 years, from 3 trees dropping seed every single season. The distance between what the trees kept offering and what was actually becoming the next generation was close to total. China's botanical institutions responded with serious, well-funded research. The methods attempted in the years that followed represented nearly the full toolkit of modern conservation biology. Grafting came first. Shoots taken from the 3 mother trees were grafted onto rootstock from related, hardier fir species, mainly Japanese fir, chosen because it was widely available and known to be tough. The grafting worked, in a sense. Genetic copies of the Baishanzu fir were produced and kept alive under controlled care. What it could not solve was the deeper issue. Grafted copies growing on borrowed rootstock in a nursery were not the same as trees rooted in the actual soil of Mount Baishanzu, tied into whatever that soil held. They were living genetic archives. They were not a recovery. Laboratory work at Jiangxi University pushed the science further. Researchers tried embryo rescue, a method that pulls developing embryos out of seeds before they fail and gives them a precisely tailored nutrient environment to keep developing on their own. The technique meant extracting embryos at an exact developmental moment and building an artificial growing environment to stand in for whatever the seeds weren't getting naturally. The team described the process as something close to performing a tiny surgery on each individual embryo, delicate and exacting, with no existing protocol to follow since no one had attempted this for this species before. The embryo rescue produced real, viable seedlings, genetically identical to their source trees. It was a genuine technical achievement. What it could not offer was an explanation for why the seeds were failing to begin with, which meant it could not fix the underlying cause, only work around it, seedling by seedling, at considerable effort and cost. After years of advanced intervention, the ground beneath the 3 mother trees stayed almost bare. The trees kept producing seed. The seed kept going nowhere. The most sophisticated tools available to botanical science had produced a small number of carefully tended seedlings in controlled settings, none of which had yet proven they could survive and grow on the actual mountain the species belonged to. Researchers also tried more conventional nursery propagation alongside the advanced techniques, collecting fresh seed each autumn and sowing it directly into prepared beds under close supervision, using fertilizers, controlled watering schedules, and protection from pests and competing plants. Even under these attentive, resource-rich conditions, germination rates stayed far below what a healthy conifer population would normally produce. The seeds that did sprout in these nursery beds often struggled afterward, growing slowly and showing signs of stress that nobody could fully explain, given how carefully the plots were tended. It was tempting, at various points across these years, to conclude that the species itself had simply lost the biological capacity to reproduce, worn down by age, by the stress of isolation, or by some genetic decline that comes with a population this small for this long. That conclusion would have meant accepting that recovery was essentially impossible no matter what anyone did. It turned out to be wrong, but proving it wrong required looking somewhere none of the laboratory work had thought to look. Something was missing, and none of the advanced approaches had found it yet. What the trees actually needed. The breakthrough, when it finally arrived, was nothing anyone deep in decades of laboratory work would have guessed. It was not a new technique. It was not fresh insight into the tree's genetics or embryology. It was a simple observation about the ground itself. The slope beneath the 3 mother trees was blanketed in a thick layer of accumulated organic debris, fallen leaves, decomposed needles, decades of seasonal shedding from the trees above and the surrounding growth. This layer was deep and unbroken. Seeds dropping from the canopy landed on top of it and stayed there. unable to push through to the bare mineral soil beneath that germination actually requires. The layer was soft enough that any root trying to take hold in it could never make proper contact with real soil. Its surface also dried out in a way the deeper ground did not, leaving germinating seeds without the moisture they needed through those critical first weeks. The fix the research team eventually tried was hand raking. Members of the conservation crew went up the slope and physically raked the organic buildup aside, clearing sections down to bare soil. There was nothing technically advanced about it. It was the kind of labor that needs no lab, no specialist, no equipment costing more than a wheelbarrow. It required people with rakes, working methodically across the slope, pulling back what had piled up and exposing what lay underneath. In the 5 years after the first systematic clearing of the slope, 687 new seedlings appeared in the ground beneath the mother trees. The gap between that number and the fewer than 3 seedlings a full decade without intervention had produced was total. The slope hadn't changed shape. The trees hadn't changed. The seeds themselves hadn't changed. The one thing that changed was the condition of the ground receiving them, and that single adjustment, requiring no advanced technology and no specialized knowledge beyond understanding that seeds need bare soil, produced a result years of sophisticated intervention had never come close to. The fungal network was the second essential piece, and it explained what had killed the 3 trees moved to botanical gardens decades before. Furs of this kind form what scientists call mycorrhizal partnerships, relationships with specific soil fungi that are not optional extras but core parts of the tree's biology. These fungi wrap around and grow into the tree's roots, extending the reach of the root system far past what the roots alone could manage, drawing water and nutrients from a much larger stretch of soil than the tree could access on its own. In return, the tree feeds the fungi sugars made through photosynthesis. That partnership is specific. The fungi a Baishanzu fir depends on are the fungi living in the soil of Mount Baishanzu, species that have evolved alongside the trees over the same thousands of years the firs have spent retreating up this one mountain. Move the tree to a garden in Beijing, and the fungi simply are not there. The root system suddenly has to operate without the extended network it was built to rely on. It can survive for a while on what its roots alone can reach, but it cannot thrive that way, and eventually it cannot survive at all. The gardens had supplied everything they knew a tree needed. They had never known about the fungi, and without the fungi, everything else fell short. Understanding this dependency reshaped how young trees were replanted afterward. Seedlings raised from grafts and embryo rescue were no longer placed into any convenient soil. They were planted in soil taken directly from the mountain, carrying the exact fungal community the trees required. They were returned to the environment their biology had actually been shaped by, rather than to a managed substitute for it. The first human-planted seedlings went back into the mountain in 2019. Young Baishanzu firs, raised in labs and nurseries carrying the genetics of the 3 ancient survivors, were placed into the ground on the same slope where those survivors still stood. They weren't replacing the old trees yet. They were the start of something 60 years of work had finally made possible. The clearing work itself turned out to require ongoing attention rather than a single fix. Organic debris does not stop falling once a slope has been raked clear one time. Needles and leaves keep shedding every season, and left alone, the same smothering layer would simply rebuild itself within a few years, undoing the very condition that had allowed germination to begin. This meant the conservation program had to shift from a one-time intervention into a maintained practice, with teams returning to the slope on a recurring schedule to keep sections of ground cleared during the window each year when seeds were falling and trying to establish themselves. The work was unglamorous and repetitive in a way that no press release could easily capture, yet it turned out to matter more than almost anything done in a laboratory. Keeping the ground clear, year after year, was what allowed the first wave of wild seedlings to survive long enough to become established young trees, rather than one good season followed by a return to failure. What else the trees gave? While the conservation effort focused on keeping the species alive, a separate line of research was studying what the species itself contained, not by using the living trees in any harmful way, but by examining the chemistry of what they naturally shed. The bark and needles the trees dropped on their own, the same organic matter that had been smothering germination in that thick layer on the ground, held compounds researchers hadn't seen in related species. Fallen material was collected without disturbing the living trees, and samples were sent off to institutions equipped to analyze their chemical makeup. The analysis turned up several molecules unusual in both structure and biological behavior. Researchers at Purdue University in the United States, working with synthetic versions of these molecules rather than material taken from the trees, found the compounds showed activity against cancer cells in lab testing. The results were early. The distance between a promising lab result and an actual clinical treatment is long, and most compounds that show early promise never finish that journey. But the finding added another dimension to what the Baishanzu fir meant, beyond conservation alone. A species that had spent thousands of years retreating up a mountain, reduced to 3 individuals on a single slope, was offering chemical information human medicine could not get from any other source. The trees had spent their entire retreat losing ground. Along the way, they had built up something nothing else quite had, a chemistry shaped by thousands of years of surviving conditions that had eliminated everything else around them. That chemistry stayed out of reach until conservation work had kept the trees alive long enough for scientists to study what they held without endangering what remained. The link between keeping the trees alive and having access to what they knew was not symbolic. It was practical. Every additional year, the 3 survivors held on was another year during which understanding their biology could deepen. And what that understanding revealed wasn't only about the trees themselves. It was about the ground beneath them, the fungi threading through that ground, the specific chemistry in their needles and bark, and the way all these pieces formed a system older and more tightly connected than any single part of it. None of this research required cutting down a single tree or stripping bark from a living trunk. Everything analyzed had already fallen naturally to the ground, material the trees had shed as part of their ordinary yearly cycle. That distinction mattered to the researchers involved, since the entire point of the decades-long recovery effort was to keep every remaining individual alive and intact. Studying what the species had already released into its environment offered a way to learn from the trees without asking anything further of them, at a point in their existence when they had already given about as much as 3 centuries-old trees reasonably could. Where things stand now. By the mid-2020s, the numbers had shifted in a way that would have seemed impossible 60 years earlier to anyone who had watched the slope shrink down to 3 old trees. From those last 3 surviving Baishanzu firs, 83 seedlings raised directly from the mother trees had survived to the stage where they could be transplanted. Across the cleared slope, more than 600 wild seedlings had appeared, each one a quiet return of the forest, germinated from seeds scattered into exposed soil after the raking. Weeks, months, and years of propagation work, through grafting, embryo rescue, and careful nursery cultivation, produced roughly 4,000 young Baishanzu firs, which were then transplanted to protected sites both on the mountain and in carefully prepared locations elsewhere, each one matched with suitable soil chemistry and fungal partners. The 3 original trees still stand on the same slope where Wu counted 7 individuals in 1963, their forms now older and more weathered, carrying the visible marks of centuries of growth and hardship. They are not healthy in the way a young tree in ideal conditions is healthy. Rather, they are ancient organisms showing the expected signs of age, which in a harsh alpine environment can be mistaken for decline. But they remain alive, continuing to flower and set seed, while the soil around their roots, carefully managed over decades by people learning what the species requires, now supports the next generation. The recovery is not complete. The figures behind the propagation program are significant, but a species with several thousand managed individuals cannot yet be considered secure. We must look instead to the few hundred seedlings now established directly on the mountain itself, growing from seed in the same soil and climate that shaped the species for millennia, entangled in the fungal networks that sustain its life. Those trees are out there now, a few hundred in number, growing slowly through cold mist and thin alpine air, their progress measured in years rather than seasons. We cannot yet know their outcome, but they persist, and in that persistence lies the uncertain future of the species. Over time, the project has come to represent more than a conservation effort. It has become a slow negotiation between human care and ecological memory, between what can be repaired and what can only be supported as it continues on its own terms, shaped by time and resilience in equal measure. Even now, researchers and forest workers return each season to monitor growth, adjust conditions, and ensure that the fragile foothold the species has regained is not lost. What the trees taught. The 60-year effort to keep the Baishanzu fir alive produced a recovery. It also produced something harder to measure but possibly more important over time, a detailed understanding of exactly what the effort got wrong for its first several decades and what it eventually got right. The early approach, collecting specimens, studying them under controlled conditions, applying the most advanced techniques available, was not wrong in its intent. It was wrong in its assumption. The assumption was that the problem with these trees could be understood from outside their natural setting and solved by substituting human-designed conditions for the specific, layered, evolved conditions the trees actually needed. The assumption was that understanding the tree meant understanding its genetics and physiology. What actually mattered turned out to be understanding the ground underneath it, the invisible partners living in that ground, and the specific path seeds take from canopy to soil when nothing stands in the way. The solution that worked, raking back the slope, protecting the fungal network, returning seedlings to native soil, demanded more humility than the laboratory work had. It required researchers to look at the slope and ask not what they could do to the trees, but what the trees needed that simply wasn't there. The answer, once it arrived, wasn't impressive the way embryo rescue is impressive. It was the kind of answer that looks obvious in hindsight and stayed invisible for decades in practice. That lesson reaches beyond this one species and this one mountain. The Baishanzu fir's resistance to sophisticated intervention was not stubbornness, it was specificity. Every living system carries a kind of specificity that stays hidden until something goes wrong. And the way things go wrong reveals connections that were there all along and simply unrecognized. The fungi in Mount Baishanzu's soil had always been part of the tree's biology. They were just invisible, and that invisibility let decades of work proceed without ever accounting for them. The larger environmental challenges the world is facing now involve the same problem, only at a much bigger scale. The systems being damaged, atmospheric, hydrological, ecological, are specific in the same way the Baishanzu fir is specific. They contain invisible components that aren't captured in the models used to study them, and they aren't addressed by interventions designed without full knowledge of what those components actually do. The lesson from the mountain isn't that sophisticated science is wrong. It's that sophisticated science applied without the patience to understand the whole system it operates within will keep arriving at the wrong answer until that patience is found. The Baishanzu fir outlasted the Ice Age by climbing a mountain one generation at a time, chasing the cold upward as the world warmed, never moving faster than the conditions it needed could keep pace with. It survived into the modern era because a small group of people spent 60 years learning to listen to what it was telling them about what it required. The young trees now growing on the slope below the three ancient survivors are the result of that listening. They are small, and the slope is large, and the mountain stays cold. they are growing anyway. 7 trees found on a mountain in 1963, 3 left by 1987. 60 years of effort, failure, adjustment, and finally understanding, not just what was being lost, but what it actually needed in order to survive. The Baishanzu fir is still there. The young trees growing beneath the old ones are still small. The story isn't finished. If this is the kind of story that stays with you, subscribe. There are more of them, and each one goes further than it first appears.